prohibited substances. So this is something that we feel a lot of people perhaps don't realise how important it is. So we wanted to just do a quick session where we could give some brief information and some pointers as to where you can find the information that you're after. So as mentioned, just a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone can keep their cameras and microphones off for now. The meeting is recorded and will be popped on YouTube, so we can share the link with people who weren't able to join live today. We will stop the recording before we have questions at the end, just so that you can feel safe to ask away without being put on YouTube yourselves. We're going to keep it nice and short with two separate sort of sections. So first of all, my colleague Laura is going to present a short little bit about what we do at Spillers to adhere to the Beta NOPS scheme. And then my colleague Sarah is going to talk about how you can manage your feed room, your store, etc., to your horses out at events, etc., everything that you can do to try and prevent any contamination occurring. Laura is our quality manager. She's been with Spillers 14 odd years now, so has a wealth of experience. Sarah Nelson is our quality manager, Sarah Nelson is our product manager, so she helps formulate the feed, and again has been with Spillers 14-15 years. So yeah, they're both really experienced. Any questions, you do feel free to pop them in the chat as we go, but we will pick them up at the end. Laura, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks Ness. So welcome everybody to today's lunchtime learning. So to kick us off, we are going to start to look at NOPS and what they are. So the definition of a prohibited substance is any substance that can exert an effect on a horse. Now, this is a broad, all-encompassing definition, and a naturally occurring prohibited substance, or NOPS as we'll get to know it, is one that is either naturally present within certain ingredients or that occurs as a result of inadvertent cross-contamination during processing before arriving at the feed manufacturer's facility. So as you can see from the slide that's shown on the screen right now, the main NOPS and their sources are caffeine and theobromine from cowco, theophylline from tea, morphine from the opium poppy, porcine and atropine from nightshade, and cannabinoids from hemp fibre and plant material. So historically, the principal risk has come from caffeine, theobromine and morphine coinciding with the cultivation of morphine poppies in the UK. In addition, porcine and atropine have occurred more frequently as a result of certain weeds containing these substances naturally being used as ingredients in horse feed. So as the world changes and emerges, our supply chains, new emerging ways of feeding, nutritional benefits from new raw materials, being more sustainable as well, and reusing food waste, these risks may change, and there may be an update on this list. So cannabinoids is a recent addition to this list because of the change in the way that we're using ingredients. So Beta NOPS is a working group, and they're continually monitoring the industry and horizon scanning for potentially emerging risks. So by doing this, in 2016, the list of herbal NOPS was introduced as a result of analytical results in raw materials. So these are for substances that are either naturally present in certain herbs that could lead to a positive test in competition, or substances that originate from weed seeds contaminating herbal supplies. So just as a quick overview, by understanding these sources of NOPS, it becomes more apparent how they may accidentally contaminate the supply chain. So, for example, a raw material truck with a previous load of biscuit meal, or poppies that are grown in a garden being blown into a field of crops causing residual growth, which then follows through in harvest. So this is why we have to operate to such a high internal and external quality standards in the sourcing of all of our raw materials, the design and the manufacture of all of our products. So we're now going to look at NOPS and how we adhere to the code. So the highly successful NOPS scheme was set up in 2009 to help reduce the risk of naturally occurring prohibited substances in equine feed. This is now a standalone code and is run solely by the British Equestrian Trade Association, or BETA. The BETA NOPS code calls for every one of its members to evaluate the risks of NOPS contamination using HACCP, so hazard analysis critical control point methodology, making sure that the following points are considered in this. So that all known NOPS are considered, that each individual feed ingredient, the source of each feed ingredient, and the transport storage of each feed ingredient before it even reaches our manufacturing facility. Then we need to look at the intake, storage and processing, and even down to the packaging in our manufacturing plant. And then consider further the dispatch, so the loading, transport and the delivery once this has gone out. So this is checked by an annual audit by an accredited auditing body to make sure that all scheme members are applying to the code in practice and are compliant. So as we've previously said, when looking at the sources of NOPS, the most common cause is a result of inadvertent cross-contamination during processing before even arriving at the feed manufacturer's facility. So here at Spillers, we only use a small supply chain of raw materials. We have strict assessments in place, audits and ongoing monitoring programs to ensure that the risk is as low as possible. For us, making sure that we've got that good relationship with our suppliers is the gatekeeper from NOPS entering into our production facility. I think it's worth kind of pointing out here at this point, that when developing a feed, it's not only the nutritional benefit that's taken into account. We will look at NOPS with raw materials as a massive factor. So if we can't identify back traceability through the food chain, look at historic risks, that kind of stops us from using a raw material altogether. And once we've understood this, we have all of these following processes in place to make sure that we are doing everything we can to continually monitor it. So all of our suppliers are audited before being used, and they must demonstrate a quality management process that is robust. And this includes accreditation to a recognised quality scheme. As part of this, they must be able to demonstrate traceability within their own supply chain. Again, that HACCP, the Hazard Awareness Critical Control Point System, risk awareness and continual improvement. Each supplier must have an awareness of NOPS, not only what it means to them, but what it means to us as a customer as well when we're using their raw materials. So making sure they really understand that supply chain, making sure they really understand the transport and storage that they're using in between. And each supplier is then risk assessed. So they're given a score of low, medium or high, which determines their ongoing monitoring process. And this is reevaluated every year. So we go through this all over again. We do the audit, the reevaluation, we're checking to make sure that they're still doing everything that they can to adhere to this. If an issue is identified, which sometimes can happen, there may be a non-conformance with the material being delivered, or there may be something that we hear of from another supplier, we will carry that audit out sooner. And it isn't until we can have all of the evidence to show that the mitigation of that risk is in place that we will start using the supplier again. So sometimes we will cease supply completely. All suppliers sign our terms and conditions, which include that awareness. So we're constantly reminding them of NOPS and what it means to them. So once we've done that due diligence piece, we're kind of then looking at, we've agreed this raw material, we're bringing it into site. What do we need to do now to make sure? So every lorry bringing raw materials into our site must have written evidence of the last 3 loads and cleaning methods for that trailer before the goods are accepted. And this forms part of our own internal HACCP. So it is a critical control point for us that they must provide this evidence to our weighbridge operator. So in addition to this, we also have a daily intake plan. So that specifies exactly the loads that are due in, where they've come from, and it has a specific purchase order number. So this purchase order number then allows us to start our own internal traceability. By completing all of these processes I've just talked about, we've already lowered this risk from the supply chain and the raw materials. But what we really then need to take into account is how we mitigate the risk in our production facility, which I'm going to talk about next. So internally, once we're manufacturing, it's really important for us, and the most important thing for us is the awareness of NOPS and the training to all of our associates from their first day on site. It's really important that they understand of the risk, why it's important for them not to eat and drink in or around the production facilities, and why their personal hygiene is so important. So if someone has a drink of coffee and they spill it down themselves, that small inclusion, if they go back in, drip some off their hands, handle some of the raw materials, could be enough to initiate a positive test. Having chocolate on their fingers, going in and picking up a utensil that they're going to use to take samples out of a feed bag, that's enough. So it's also really important to make sure that they're not taking personal items into these areas, such as vapes and tobacco, any creams that may have CBD oils in them, because this could also cause contamination. So training for us is a really important thing, and this is updated annually to make sure that associates are kept up to date with any changes in the NOPS code or any changes to processes that we may have on site, and just to give that general reminder. So not only do we do this within our associates, but we also give the same induction to contractors and visitors when on site. Generally, when they are contractors or visitors, are generally with another associate, but it's really important for them to understand what the risk is from them as well. All of our products have batch numbers and best before dates, which allow the product to be traced back. So this goes right back to where I said about the purchase order number for intake. We know which materials have gone into which silos. We can then trace back finished product through the manufacturer right back to the raw materials. Again, this goes back to the supplier relationship, that we then have that trust that they can trace back almost to field where everything has come from. So if we needed to, we can see from dispatch as well. These batch numbers allow us to see which customers have taken which products, and actually the quantity of the products that they've taken should we ever need it. We retain all raw material samples, in progress materials, finished product, and ton samples of our higher end products, should they be needed in future. This could be for visuals, for analytical. It can give us an understanding of if there's been a change during the manufacturing of the product as well. Each raw material is assessed, so it has a risk assessment itself. And this is looking at the nature of the risk. So is NOPS prevalent to the risk to this raw material? And then looking at its supply chain. So something that has a shorter supply chain doesn't have as much risk as a longer supply chain. This information then dictates the nature of testing that's required and its frequency. A point here is testing is not always beneficial, because sampling methods can be tricky due to the nature of the distribution of NOPS. So this can be pocketed or unevenly distributed. And again, this goes back to the point, this is why it is so important to have the relationships with our suppliers and understand our supply chain. We make life a little bit easier for ourselves here on site. We have no medicated feeds on our site. So all manufacturing of spillers feeds takes place in a medication-free facility. We also have control of all of the products that we manufacture. And as well as all of these above, we have accreditation not only to the Beta NOPS code, but to maintain our quality assurance on site. We're also accredited to 9001-2015 quality standard and UFAS, the Universal Feed Assurance Scheme. So we're audited annually by both of these accreditation bodies, and they look at the quality standards here on site. So that's literally from the management commitment, policies and procedures, traceability, recall, our manufacturing processes, and continuous improvement, just to name a few. And both are audited with regulatory bodies. And then finally, we continue to work with 𝗵𝘁, with sporting and governing bodies to ensure that appropriate workable measures are in place to reduce the risks of prohibited substance being present in equine feed and stuff. And we're continually horizon scanning to see what could be the next risk. So that's it from me. I shall hand over to Sarah.
You would think by now, wouldn't you, that I'd remember to press the unmute button. Thank you very much, Laura. Fabulous introduction for me to follow on. So my role this morning is to give you some practical tips that you can go away with to help you manage the risk of contamination on yard or when you're out and about. So Laura has done a fabulous job this morning of explaining what it means to be a 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 approved supplier. And hopefully now you feel a bit more confident and understand a little bit more about why it's so important that you use only 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 approved feeds and supplements. So the first thing that you can do to help you mitigate the risk of contamination is, of course, to look for that official 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 logo on pack. Something I would say is be really mindful, careful of what I've called here free from claims. So any claims that talk about the risk of prohibited substances, but they aren't supported with that 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 logo. So things like does not contain any substances on a banned list, or does not include prohibited substances as part of the recipe. All of those claims, or none of those claims, should I say, are the same as having 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 approval. So every single feed and supplement manufacturer that is 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 accredited can use that official 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 logo on the packaging. So that's a really easy thing for you to look for. There is also a web checker on the 𝗵𝘁 website. So there's an example there on the screen for you. I've just typed in Spillers, so you can put in any brand name of any equine feed or supplement and see whether or not they're listed. But I really, really can't stress enough to you that the safeguarding does not stop with choosing a 𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗃 approved feed. And it is really important that as riders, you understand what else you need to do to help you mitigate that risk, because once that feed has left our site, we have no control over it. And we can stick very diligently to all of those measures that Laura's discussed with you this morning. But unfortunately, there are still plenty of opportunities for contamination to occur. And now my able assistant Laura is going to move to the next slide for me, just to save us having any sticky moments of changing control. So first of all, check that all of the feeds and supplements that you're purchasing are correctly labelled. So I don't expect you, of course, to understand the intricacies of feed labelling law, but every single product that you buy should have a feed label on it. And those labels can be in different places depending on the product. So in the Spillers range, if you're buying a fibre product, then the label is printed in the white box on the back of the bag. If you're buying a balancer, a mash or a cube, there's a white ticket sewn into the top of the bag. And if you're buying a course mix, your label is now a sticky label on the back of the bag. Check that it's labelled and check that it's fully sealed prior to purchase. If there are any damages, do not accept it. and keep a copy of the delivery note and/or a receipt. Make sure you record all of the batch details and best before dates for every feed and supplement that you buy and use. And it seems like a bit of a inconvenient thing to have to do, or sounds a bit time consuming, but once you get into the habit of it, it's a really valuable thing to do. Also keep a sample just in case there should be any issues along the way. Keep a sample of every feed and supplement that you use for 2 months after you've used it. And of course, make sure that you record the batch details, the best before date. Make sure you store it in a cool, dry place so it's not going to get spoiled, and make sure that you've got either labelled it in writing correctly, or ideally kept the label from the bag and kept it with that sample. Thank you, Laura. So once you've covered off all of the safe purchasing, storage and record keeping relating to your feeds, think about how you manage the feeding on yard. So really practical things like avoiding sharing buckets between horses, and wash all buckets and stirrers, feed scoops thoroughly after use. Make sure that you're sourcing your forage from a reputable supplier and look out for weeds. Laura touched in the beginning on the possibility of weeds causing contamination. And make sure the feed room is locked when it's not in use. It's the safest way of you keeping things under control, is to make sure that nobody can get in there when it's not being used. And keep the feed room for feed. So don't store animal feed, medications, cleaning products, grooming kits, first aid kits in the feed room. Keep a feed only in the feed room rule. And thank you, Laura. And Laura talked about the no eating and drinking policies that we have in our meal on site. And I am one of those people that cannot function and get through the day without caffeine. It was the same when I worked on a yard, and it's the same when I sit behind a desk. But it's really important to adopt a strict no eating and no drinking in the feed room or the stable policy. We really can't stress enough how there is a possibility of something as small as Laura says, as having chocolate on your hands, a drip of coffee from a cup can get into a feed and potentially result in a positive test. There are many human feeds and drinks that contain NOPS, so things that many of us love to indulge in, particularly when we're working hard outside: biscuits, cakes, chocolate, tea, coffee, fizzy drinks. So make sure that none of these things are in your feed room, in your stable, and of course don't use human feeds for treats for your horse. So we're not going to talk specifically about the risks of drugs, but do take real care with medications and first aid around the yard. So the first thing is, don't use homemade remedies or anything of herbal unknown origin. It's just not worth the risk. Make sure that all medications are stored in their original packaging and inside a locked box to keep them safe. Just like with feed, record keeping is really important. So we want to keep a record of the horse's name, the medication, the dose rate, the treatment dates, and very importantly, of course, check withdrawal periods with your vet. When you're giving first aid or administering medication, wear gloves and wash your hands afterwards. Laura's talked about the importance of personal hygiene on our site, and the same theory applies in yard when it comes to feed and also medication. Use separate buckets and stirrers for horses that are on medication, and don't share them between horses, and take a lot of care, extra care with powders. I'm sure you've all seen it when you put a powdered supplement into a bucket. You can get a plume of supplement sometimes. It's really easy for powders, including medication, to contaminate the surrounding environment. So take extra care. And of course, if there are ever any spillages of anything, make sure that they're cleaned up fully straight away. Next slide, please, Laura. And I did miss one point on medication. No need though, Laura, to change the slide, but something that I didn't pop on that slide was be careful with topical products as well. So be really clear from the manufacturer or the vet about the risk of topical products that can be absorbed through the skin and may result in a positive test. Around the yard, avoid hemp bedding because of the risk of cannabinoid contamination. Laura spoke earlier about the increasing and emerging risks surrounding hemp. Avoid sharing tack and grooming kits and other equipment between horses. Clean and disinfect stables before they're used by new horses, and clean and disinfect the lorry and trailer after every use. And then my final points before we move on to questions are about staff and visitors. So just as we include training for all of our own associates and visitors to site, that's a really important thing for you to start incorporating as well if you don't already. So make sure all of your staff and visitors are fully aware of the potential sources of NOPS and the safety measures that you've put in place. These protocols are not going to be any help if the people that are visiting your yard or working in your yard aren't aware of them. Ask staff to declare medications that they're taking and, of course, advise them of all the risks and the importance of understanding why medication shouldn't be in their pockets or in their feed room. And check out the information and resources that are provided by 𝗪𝘁. They have some really good free of charge resources, information, posters. There's one example there on the screen that you can print off or download. 𝗪𝘁 can post some out, I think, but check out those resources and look at where you can incorporate them in and around the yard, because there is no such thing as being too careful. I think the last slide is just an opportunity for us to say thank you for joining. I appreciate you're all really busy, but it's commendable for anybody taking time out of their day to learn about this stuff. It is really important. There are a few minutes left for us to take any questions. Bella will stop the recording now so that you do feel comfortable, if you would like